Such perfection. This particular opening, I've been rehearsing it with these guys. So they did it well. Um, so, yeah, just to say that before we start, that the books that are coming out from, or have come out from the Literary Activism imprint are on display over there, and there's one copy of Against Storytelling, which is one of the two books which will come out next month from the imprint. Unfortunately, they're not for sale because we're not allowed to sell books right now over here. So, but for you to see, and if you're curious, they're on sale elsewhere. And we've had a live streaming sort of thing going on this time. I've been trying to keep it under wraps as far as Ashoka students are concerned, because we want people to come to the venue. But we did have around 300 people watching on YouTube yesterday, and I've got sort of messages from people, artists and writers that I know in, say, in Germany or the UK writing in. So that was nice. I mention it because it's, for us, it's a new thing. We've never done it before. So now we will get going with the talks. Sanchit will introduce the chair.
Hello everyone, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time today, and welcome back to those of you who are here for the second day of the 9th Symposium in the Literary Activism series. The first session of the day by Professor Tim Beasley-Murray is titled Going for Bust, Bolaño, The Broken Conference and Deep Play. Professor Huzaifa Omair Siddiqi is going to be chairing the session, and I'm going to introduce him. Huzaifa Omair Siddiqi is an assistant professor at Ashoka University. His research is on the French material phenomenologist Michel Henry, as well as on the Urdu poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. He is currently working on a history of the reception of European philosophy by South Asian thinkers like Muhammad Iqbal and B.R. Ambedkar, tentatively titled Subcontinental Philosophy. Over to Dr. Siddiqi.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm glad to see everyone here, and especially those of us, those of you I can't see, I'm welcoming those of you as well. So today we have Professor Tim Beasley-Murray as first speaker, and his title is Going for Bust, Bolaño, The Broken Conference and Deep Play. And he's an associate professor of European culture at the University College London, and he's studied at various places like Cambridge, Paris, and he seems to know almost all modern European languages and some ancient European languages as well. Right. So we have a really interesting paper, and apparently he's told me before the conference, that I should keep it as short as possible because he wants to go for bust. So I leave it up to Professor Tim Beasley-Murray. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huzaifa. I think I'll stand to do this. Can I shut this laptop, Sanchit? So first of all, my thanks. Thank you above all to Amit for inviting me here, for organising this fantastic conference that has been revelatory. It's allowed me the excuse for a first trip to India in my life, which is also revelatory, but not simply to Amit. Particular thanks to Sanchit, who is the real power behind the throne and has made things so good for all of us conference participants. Thank you to the fellow speakers who I've enjoyed being in discussion with over the last few days as we try and work out what bust means. Thank you to Huzaifa for keeping your introduction very short, although I hope that you will have many things to say afterwards. And thank you to those of you who are here in the room today and also online. My title is Going for Bust, Bolaño, The Broken Conference and Deep Play. And if I get my thanks in first, it is because I'm sorry to say, I'm pretty certain that I'm going to disappoint you all. there is no way that I can lay claim to the incision, erudition, conceptual sophistication of Andres' paper yesterday, with its analysis of essayism, displacement, the dislocation of translation that defines Latin American bust traditions. There is little hope that I could aspire to Amit's arrogance, his dithering pirouettes that took us from imagined and real Chile to non-bust busts in Calcutta mansions via a takedown of Renaissance Italian and Bengali. Certainly I shall fall short of the humour, beauty, political relevance and sheer exuberance of Pushpala's Mother's India and her bust archive. And doubtless I shall lack the Teutonic rigour and philosophical clarity of Leonhardt and his account of the deluded boom of contemporary art with its political pretensions and mauvaise foi, and his persuasive call for a punk nihilism or perhaps the bust modesty of an art of the political. No, in contrast to all these things, I shall disappoint you. For, as my brother joked, only semi-joking, semi-seriously, when I told him about this conference and his theme, all I really have to do is perform myself. A middle-aged academic, bankrupt of inspiration, bust, out of energy, out of ideas. And indeed, this is what I intend to do, perform the bust, knowing, as Bolaño urges us, that I will fail in advance. So Bolaño. The first part of 2666 by Bolaño, the author who's provided the inspiration for Amit and for this conference, is curiously all about conferences. And it's all about a literary boom in the making. Titled The Part About the Critics, it tells the story of four scholars, the Frenchman Pelletier, the Spaniard Espinosa, the Italian Mellini, and the Englishwoman Norton, and their discovery of an overlooked and mysterious German author, the improbably named Benno von Arcimboldi, of whom almost nothing is known, not even his whereabouts, and who may, indeed, the novel suggests, turn out to be a serial killer in the Mexican Badlands. Gradually, largely thanks to these scholars' activity as Arcimboldi translators, article writers, and conference organizers, Arcimboldi's studies enters what one might term a boom. At a series of conferences, the four critics bring Arcimboldi's oeuvre to a wider academic audience, resulting in a flurry of scholarly activity, culminating in a further conference called Reflecting the 20th Century, the Work of Benno von Arcimboldi. Now, to describe this literary critical jamboree, Bolaño writes an extraordinary sentence. It's one long sentence, it's 26 lines long, and it's contained within parentheses. Right? It's this moment of Bolañian exuberance. And I quote most of it here. Okay, and I quote. Espinosa and Pelletier's participation in the conference Reflecting the 20th Century, the work of Benno von Arcimboldi, was at best null, at worst catatonic. Nor did it go unnoticed by the latest litter of Archimboldians, recent graduates, boys and girls, their doctorates tucked still warm under their arms, who planned by any means necessary to impose their particular readings of Arcimboldi, like missionaries ready to instill faith in God, even if to do so meant signing a pact with the devil. For most were what you might call rationalists, not in the philosophical sense, but in the pejorative literal sense, denoting people less interested in literature than in literary criticism. Although often incapable of telling their asses from their elbows, and although they noticed a there and not there, an absent presence in the fleeting passage of Pelletier and Espinosa through Bologna, they were incapable of seeing what was really important. Pelletier's and Espinosa's absolute boredom regarding everything said there about Arcimboldi, or their negative disregard for the gaze of the others, as if the two were so much cannibal fodder, a disregard lost on the young conference goers, those eager and insatiable cannibals, their 30-something faces bloated with success, their expectations shifting from boredom to madness, their coded stutterings speaking only 2 words, love me, or maybe 2 words and a phrase, love me, let me love you, though obviously no one understood. We have all been at conferences like the one that Bolaño's narrator describes, populated by eager litters of cannibals, bloated with success, who speak in coded stutterings and seek to persuade themselves as much as the audience that what they say is of importance. Meanwhile, part of us, like Pelletier and Espinosa, drifts off into disregard and boredom. Are you bored now? Are you drifting off into disregard? And if we listen carefully, all that can be heard beneath the drone that threatens never to stop are infantile, libidinous babblings that no one understands. Bolaño's cannibalistic neophyte Archimboldians remain transfixed by the grotesque zeppelin of the literary boom and by the overinflated criticism that accompanies such phenomena. They utterly fail to grasp a Bolañian conception of literature. Can there be a worse epithet in Bolaño's mouth than to be characterized as being more interested in literary criticism than in literature? The resulting conference, and conferences like it, and I would remark not this one, with their bloatings and flatulent babblings, a phenomena of the boom, noisy and buoyant, but fundamentally meaningless, fundamentally empty, full only of hot air. Reflecting the 20th century, the work of Benno von Archimboldi is one of the last conferences that our 4 critics attend in Bolaño's novel. In contrast to the cannibalistic Archimboldian neophytes, the 4 critics, Pelletier, Espinosa, Mellini, and Norton, grasp what literature really means. That is, that it means and matters viscerally as much as life and death, for it is life and death. These quartet of critics, a motley bunch of Bolañian heroes, understand what is at stake in literature. Leaving the comfortable university precincts of Europe, overstepping the boundaries of academia, this quartet pursue their chimerical object of study, Archimboldi, literally to the ends of the earth, into the dangerous and unbounded territory of the Mexican desert and to the fictional border town of Santa Teresa, a place where literature is inextricable from violence and risk. Unlike the cannibalistic neophyte conference goers who play it safe according to the rules of the academic game, who hedge their bets, these hero critics are prepared to stake all that they have, willing to overplay their hand, willing to go for bust. So, now to this conference here, a conference not of the boom, but of the bust and bust traditions. When Amit first shared with me his manifesto, I was, I admit, like many of us, it seems, somewhat perplexed. I found it hard to understand how I might connect my work with the theme of the conference. I've recently finished a manuscript that explores the analogy that holds, on the one hand, between academic activity, literature, and on the other hand, play and games. In this book, I argue that as literary critics, as academics in the humanities, too often we are content with what one might call mere game playing. We pretend that what we do is serious, but actually we engage with both literature and life in a sterile form of ludism. In contrast, in the book, I suggest that what we need to do as academics, critics, writers, is to play more seriously, to allow the games that we play to spill out over the boundaries of the game and onto the more risky territory of real life. And then I saw it. I saw the connection with Amit in this conference. Playing seriously, transgressing this border between mere game and real life is, to use the analogy of cards and card games, playing for high stakes, overplaying one's hand, playing in such a way that one might go for bust. So, in this paper, I will do the following things. Drawing heavily, cannibalistically, I'm sorry to say, on my book manuscript, I will give an account of a paper that I gave at another conference, where, unintentionally, to some extent, I ended up going for bust, and possibly broke or bust that conference in so doing. And I want to use this account to think about forms of play and the way in which we, as academics, critics, and writers, might play more seriously, might risk more, might productively go for bust. Forms of what I will call deep play. So, now we come to the mise en abîme, to the story within the story, which is my account of the broken conference, which happened about 18 months ago at UCL. You have to imagine that this is if you have a Rahmengeschichte, the outside story, this is the story inside. I arrived at the conference not long after it had started, but I wasn't due to give my paper until the last session of the day. The conference was on the nexus of the creative and the critical. The organist had invited me to contribute, and hence I had been lucky enough not to have had to specify in advance too much detail of what I was going to say. On the morning of the conference, I had by no means finished my paper, but I had a long text that I knew I needed to edit and cut down in length. Nonetheless, I was buoyant and had high hopes. My paper was going to be amusing, metacritical, creative. My paper was going to be my own account of what was one of the most egregiously provocative and problematic conference papers I have ever had the opportunity to witness. So we have got Matryoshka, we've got Russian dolls, okay, or conferences within conferences.
And you told me that you were editing your paper down for size.
But not right now. That's already happened. But yes.
Like 2 days ago.
Yeah. I thought that my auto-fictional account of somebody else's conference paper that had, in my view, pushed academic discourse to the limits would in turn, through my own pushing of academic discourse to the limits, be a further witty, provocative, but not unhelpful contribution to a conference that aimed at exploring the boundaries of academic discourse. But, combined with these hopes, I had an uneasy feeling, a feeling I couldn't put my finger on, a vertiginous sense that what I was going to do entailed risks, and it might all end up rather badly. Normally at conferences, I'm reasonably well prepared. As a result, I'm able to take the temperature of the room, take into account speakers and audiences' positions and real-time reactions. Here, I was not properly prepared, and I was not listening properly to what the other speakers were saying as they gave their papers. Instead, I was editing my text drastically, excising what I intuited might go down the wrong way because context was lacking, and trying to add in some context that might better explain. At the same time, half listening, I sensed that there might already be a tension in the air of the conference, possibly gendered between the male and female speakers, possibly about different understandings of the political role of the creative critical. At the lunch break, I confessed to a friend and colleague, Nicola, my inchoate premonition that things might go wrong, but she encouraged me to soldier on and to give the paper that I had been intending to give. The clock ticked down all the way to the final session. Let me summarize briefly my paper. It was, as I've already said, a meta paper, which makes this paper a meta paper. It was an account, with my own subjectivity foregrounded, of a conference paper given by Marina Grzinic of the University of Vienna, whom I termed the Slovene art theorist. I sort of shrouded her under anonymity. In her paper that I had attended, Grzinic addressed the migrant crisis, critiquing the policies of Fortress Europe and their consequences in deaths of African and Asian migrants on European shores. She did so in terms such as turbo and necrocapitalism, the buffet of life, terms that were opaque and theoretically convoluted. Moreover, as a means of responding to and combating these horrific realities, both the migrant crisis and necro-capitalism, Grzinic proposed a form of academic and artistic activism that she illustrated with photographs and pieces of video. These were images of leather-clad activists rubbing themselves up against gravestones and playing with dildos. This she termed porno-vandalism. For Grzinic, porno-vandalism is the correct response to necro-capitalism and the exclusion of migrants from Fortress Europe. My paper, in turn, explored, perhaps mocked, the disparity between the seriousness of the topic that Grzinic was addressing in her paper and the ludicrous aspect of her approach to making sense of it. Above all, porno-vandalism as an academic artistic intervention. I found this disparity morally obscene, and my response to this obscenity was the following. I contrasted the ludicrous of Grzinich's paper with the seriousness of her underlying topic, structural violence, European indifference to the deaths of racialized others. My paper, in sum, combined a high degree of playfulness with a high degree of seriousness in a way that, at least at first, I was proud of. As I launched into my paper, overcoming the vertigo that always accompanies the beginning of a public performance, I felt good. My sentences tripped off my tongue fluently. I enjoyed my turns of phrase and turns of thought. I had a sense that my ideas were landing, making an impact, although, head buried in my text, I couldn't tell exactly what the impact was. I allowed myself to be carried away by crescendi and diminuendi, meaningful accelerandi and rallentandi. But as I reached my final ritardando and coda, I looked up and began to realize that something was wrong. Looking out over the 50 or so people there, I could see consternation on people's faces. And then, to my shock, I saw that at least one person in the audience was in tears. My paper shuddered to a close, and the chair invited questions from the floor. The initial silence was fraught, conflictual, uncertain. A first awkward question resulted in an awkward response from the speaker who had given her paper before me, and then the most institutionally significant member of the audience, the director of an institute with an important national function in my discipline, stood up and exclaimed, "I will not be silenced." And then she walked out, having said no more. The discussion that followed reduced to a discussion about whether we could discuss, and it was decided that we could not. Some sort of conversation eventually did come about with some of the participants later, including, incidentally, the person who was in tears, who was very generous, in a pub off campus. There, whilst I was treated with kindness, I felt stared at, part pariah, part object of pity and prurient curiosity. I had broken the conference and felt somewhat broken. What was it that I had got wrong? What happened certainly confirmed the usefulness of the analogy between what we do in academia and play and games. I had broken the rules. I had acted unfairly. I had committed a foul, probably a series of fouls, and deserved to be penalized by being shown a red card. I had bussed the conference because I had overplayed my hand. I had played too much, had gone for bust. But how? Had I been listening more carefully over the course of the day, I would have realized that a good number of the speakers in the audience were creative critical practitioners who thought of their work, acts that blur the distinction between critical commentary and art, as significant interventions in politically and socially charged struggles. This is sort of what Leonhard was talking about yesterday. While their positions and creations might not have been quite as extreme and absurd as Grzinic and her porno vandalism, they identified with her and understandably felt attacked by my parodic assault on her and her pretensions to seriousness. Their hurt and hostility then rested on a disagreement about the right to play and the right to seriousness and the right to be taken seriously. My paper drew attention to Grzinić's full seriousness towards a serious matter and the ridiculousness of porno vandalism as a response to violence and racist exclusion. And it did so through play. But some of the audience objected. I had no right to play, no right to mock Grzinić and the seriousness of her artistic academic activism and similar creative critical interventions by others. By refusing to take her performance seriousness at its word, I denied her and others like her the right to be taken seriously, while I myself assumed a right to play. Furthermore, as became clear to me, all of this related to gendered and social privilege. These listeners thought that my embrace of play was an exhibition of my privilege, male, white, middle-aged, middle class, secure in my job at a British prestigious university, at the expense of someone whom they thought of as an East European woman. Incidentally, by the way, that's a bit of a cliche when thinking about Slovenia. Most Slovenes would not think of themselves, they would think of themselves as firmly at the heart of European culture. In sum, the conference broke, I think, over a painfully felt disagreement about rights to seriousness and playfulness. Play is an ambivalent phenomenon, morally and in other ways, and the fact that we often associate it with children by no means guarantees its innocence and does not obscure its power. So for the rest of what I have to say, I want to look at three modes of playing, briefly: playing at, playing with, and finally what I call play proper, which I'll end up calling deep play. So, playing at. Playing at is when we pretend, fully consciously, that we are not who or what we pretend to be. Here we stand apart, hide ourselves behind masks, and deny responsibility for our actions. Oh, I was just playing. Playing at of this sort is closely related to power. It assumes that one can mess around with things that other people have to take seriously. The impression that I gave at the conference, I think, was that I was merely playing at being an academic giving a paper in the humanities, and that I did so from a position of privilege, as white, middle-class, middle-aged, male academic with job security, in a world where others with less of those forms of privilege may have no jobs at all, or whose jobs may be at risk. Playing at means that one can always step out of the game, fall back on one's own serious reality, claim that one was only joking, a form of winning where to walk away unscathed is the prize. This playing at comes at the expense of others. So, one reason, as I say, my paper went down badly was the sense that I was playing at, that protected by my coat of privilege, I could assume the right to play and then walk away unscathed. Yes, it was an unpleasant experience. I felt dreadful, confused, guilty, hurt, uncertain, as if I'd managed to upend the entire chessboard with an unintended gesture of gauche violence, and was left humiliated and alone amongst the broken pieces. But yes, I walked away, and in some senses, it didn't matter. A step on from playing at is playing with. With this I mean the sort of playing with, the toying with, that one party forces on another against their will, the cat that toys with a mouse, the psychopathic criminal who toys with his victim, the political and economic class that appears to play and toy with the lives of ordinary people, whether in Downing Street lockdown parties or in the recklessness of financial speculation. These one-sided games are the worst. The person who treats everybody else as their playthings assumes all the freedom of game and none of the responsibility of seriousness. The people who are played with enjoy nothing of this freedom in what for them is no game and where they are condemned to live with the inescapable consequences. Meanwhile, the person who plays, like the person who plays at, the person who plays with, can step in and out of the game at will on their own terms, always apart, always set up to win. The very last thing that I insist that I wanted to do at the conference was play with. But there's a third possibility, beyond playing at, beyond playing with, what I'm simply going to call play. Serious play, deep play, good play, play proper, play perhaps without any qualifying adjective indeed. What do I mean by this? In man-playing games, Robert Caillois distinguishes 4 basic domains of play that appear as pairings. Alea, chance, agon, competition, mimicry, and ilinx, vertigo. And I'm going to talk for a moment about ilinx, which is often the form of game that is least focused on when people think about Caillois. For Caillois, ilinx, or vertigo, includes games which are, and I quote, based on the pursuit of vertigo and which consist of an attempt to momentarily destroy the stability of perception and inflict a kind of voluptuous panic upon an otherwise lucid mind, end of quotation. Here he notes it is a question of, and I quote, surrendering to a kind of spasm or shock which destroys reality with sovereign brusqueness, end of quotation. The examples that he gives include mountain climbing, skiing, fun fairs, helter-skelters, whirling dervishes, and Mexican voladores, children swinging and whooping, and in what he terms their corrupt manifestations, the intoxications of alcohol and drugs. Ilinx may seem a relatively marginal form of play. Still, the differences from other forms of play are important. Ilinx, in its purest form, is an activity done entirely for its own sake, where nothing is to be won or lost. Rather, in ilinx, players invest themselves entirely, put themselves fully on the line. They fling themselves down the mountain, with the paradoxical purpose of losing, indeed, of losing themselves. Games and play, as Caillois recognizes, rarely, if ever, belong to one domain alone. Rather, they contain elements that belong to various domains. An element of ilinx is indispensable to play without a qualifying preposition, deep, serious play. It's there in the late-night card game where the world reduces to red and black in a pool of lamplight. And here, by the way, I know the IPL is just about to start up, and I was trying to put a cricket metaphor in, but I'm going to use rugby metaphor because rugby is the game that I take seriously. So this may be incomprehensible to those of you who don't know the game of rugby. It is there in the collective quickening of 100,000 Millennium Stadium heartbeats in the 80th minute of a Grand Slam deciding rugby match. It is there in the Grand Master hunched over the chessboard, concentrated but lost in thought. All these moments provide an opportunity for a simultaneous focusing and loosening of the self. In play proper, we are fully concentrated and fully distracted. In play proper, we are both fully present and fully absent. Present in a way that makes alibis impossible. Oh, I was just playing. Absent in a way that makes space for others. Play proper is not myopic. In play proper, we play heads up, eyes wide open, alive to the other players of the game, making space for them, sensing and anticipating their movements, whether as opponents or members on the same team. And play proper is not narcissistic. In play proper, we both lose ourselves, escaping ourselves and the mirror, and find something of us that the mirror could never tell us, something that was only latently there before. And the result? No one loses. No one wins. The humble perfection of play. The piano player whose fingers sweep across the keyboard, not subject to conscious control, is lost, but never expresses herself to a rapt concert hall more in that moment. This is a rugby again. The winger who bursts down the touchline, legs swerving and sidestepping beneath him, finding space between players on the field that seems not to be there, is never more present than in that moment where he loses himself, ghosting past the opposing team. The writer whose prose hurtles out in front of her, tumbling in ludic freedom, taking on a logic that exceeds any design, is both her novel and nowhere to be found in it. Just as we who give ourselves up to reading it can lose ourselves in reverie but find ourselves in it anew. But in all these cases, at every moment, the possibility of collapse, of failure, of going bust is there. Right? At any moment, the fingers could go wrong. At any moment, the winger could be taken out. At any moment, right, it could all collapse. It's this delicate balance. It's like a spinning toy. What I was aiming to do in that conference, but clearly failed to do, what I'm attempting to do in this one, what I like to think that we should be doing as academics, critics, and writers, is playing like this, playing with an element of ilinx, even at the risk of going for bust. This is, to use another qualifying term, deep play, and here again the connection with going for bust should be clear. In his notes on the Balinese cockfight, Clifford Geertz draws on a distinction that Bentham makes between shallow and deep play. For Bentham, shallow play is where what is at stake, counters and matches, small amounts of money, is of a magnitude that winning or losing won't make any substantial difference to us. Deep play, by contrast, is where we risk gaining or losing all, where we risk going bust. This is play, in Geertz's summary of Bentham, where, and I quote, "the stakes are so high that from a utilitarian standpoint, it would be irrational for the player to engage in it at all." End of quote. And since the damage entailed in losing would cause such devastation to the parties to the game, games of this kind also threaten the good of society as a whole. As a result, Bentham argues that deep play should not merely be considered immoral, but also should be banned by law. Forms of deep play might indeed be extreme cases, and they might, from the point of view of social utility, rightly be considered objectionable. But precisely as Grenzfall, they may tell us something important about games and about their place in life. Deep play can exist in the everyday, albeit at that point where the everyday tips over into the tragic. Thus, one might think of the father, in a cliched way, the main breadwinner, who in a moment of crisis liquidates the family's assets and puts them with one last roll of the dice on a 50-1 outsider in the 2:30 race at Doncaster. Fiction and real life are full of these desperate gambles that threaten total ruin but bring the glimmer of salvation into sight. Beyond the everyday, however, deep play may take on a more existential aspect. For example, when what is at stake is not simply a livelihood, but life. Games where life itself is at stake can, in turn, take different forms. They can be voluntary. I don't know if you've seen the Korean Netflix series Squid Game, but this is a deadly game show where the participants risk being killed, but they choose to sign up to. Or Russian roulette, as played by desperados, where the decision to play is precisely an expression of extreme freedom. They can also be involuntary, as in the Japanese film Battle Royale, whose players are kidnapped and dumped on an island, and whereas there is no choice about playing the game of final elimination. Or Russian roulette, as played in the film The Deer Hunter, where captured US soldiers are forced to pick up a revolver and try their luck as part of an external betting game by the Vietnamese captors. And such games may offer substantial rewards. The 20 golden coins that Vukic wins in an early form of Russian roulette in Lermontov's The Fatalist, the unthinkably large amounts of cash that the players' Squid Game stand to win, honours from a king in the favour of a lady in the case of the medieval knights who risked their lives in the joust, or they may offer no rewards at all, simply life itself. In this last category, we find at the voluntary end of things, once again Russian roulette, played alone as an existential test of will. This is something that Graham Greene recounts in disturbing detail in his teenage experiments in A Sort of Life. What do these forms of deep play tell us? Well, let's go back to the cockfight. For Geertz, what is deep about the Balinese cockfight is not the amounts of money and prestige that will be won and lost, stakes that will be sufficiently high to make the game irrational, immoral, and ideally illegal from a Benthamite point of view. What is deep is the way that the disjuncture between the game and rationality allows the game to make visible an image of Balinese society as a whole in its complex stratifications of gender, status, and so on. This is something, Geertz argues, that it can only do by being merely a game and so much more than a game at the same time. The cockfight enables what Geertz terms the imposition of meaning on life, that, and I quote, major end and primary condition of human existence, that excess of significance more than compensates for the economic costs involved. The cockfight and its symbolic richness, a process and result of making life visible in its meaningfulness, albeit through the displacement of a game that is both life and in another sense not part of it. Here we may be nearing an understanding of the profundity of play and games, providing they are profound. Play might be a means of imposing meaning on life, and through its opaquely symbolic function of enabling us to make sense of life, to see it as a whole, even to make it bearable. Now, and I'm coming to the end, Huzaifa, you'll be thankful to hear. How might all this relate to what we do in academia, in the humanities? Let us recapitulate what is at stake in academia. On the one hand, nothing is at stake. No failure is possible. If my innovative reading of Baudelaire is wrong, whatever that might mean, or fails, according to some criteria that would be difficult to determine, what have I lost? Nothing. I have risked and staked nothing. On the other hand, let us say that I've devoted my life to the study of Baudelaire and the French poetry of the 19th century, as a good number of academics' colleagues do, then what I have staked is no more and no less than my life. Let me put it plainly. It is absurd, irrational, immoral, and possibly to be made illegal that dynamic, intelligent, talented women and men should devote their lives to Baudelaire, the mind-body relationship, painting techniques of the Italian Renaissance, Dialektik im Stillstand, or whatever it might be, when there is so little to be won, and what is to be won is of such marginal utility, both individually and socially. The life that we stake in our work, moreover, is not simply our life in the literal sense of our 80 years and 10, a working life and the energies we invest in it. As academics in the humanities, what we invest in our work is our lives in the sense of our wholeness of human beings. So if we write about Baudelaire, there is nothing important about what we say about Baudelaire. Baudelaire remains unchanged. But what is important is what we say about ourselves, what we find important in Baudelaire. What we say about Baudelaire says about the way that we see the world and how it is meaningful or not, how what we say about Baudelaire speaks to others or not. Thus, in a way that means the consequences of what we do are both far less and far greater than in any other domain of activity, apart from the creative arts that are here analogous, what we risk in writing about Baudelaire is both nothing and everything. When I write about Baudelaire, I stand to gain nothing, for there is no real social utility in what I do, but if I fail, I lose everything, because my writing's failure is not external to me. It is my failure as a human being that has given shape to it. This is Russian roulette in the variant played by Graham Greene. It produces and wins nothing, and nonetheless, our lives are at stake. Whatever the case, it seems certain that what we do is deep play, or at least has the potential to be such. And thus, from a Geertzian rather than a Benthamite perspective, what we do in the humanities suddenly looks different. For Geertz indicates that our deep play is not concerned with utility. Rather, here the value of what we do, and I repeat, through the illusions and distorting mirrors of play, whatever they might be, complex analyses of Baudelairean verse, form and painting techniques in the Renaissance, angel on pinhead meditation on mind and body, Kabbalistic splutterings on dialectical image. What we might win here is an image of the complexity of life as a whole, an image that might make life meaningful. But this gain is only there to be had if our play is deep enough, if we play seriously, putting our whole lives on the line, risking going for bust. In the words of Bolaño that I shamelessly steal from Andres and his handout yesterday, and I quote, "The only experience necessary for writing is the experience of the aesthetic phenomenon, a commitment, or rather a bet, where the artist puts his life on the table, knowing beforehand, moreover, that he is going to come out defeated. The latter is important, knowing that you are going to lose." End of quotation. This is what I've been trying to do in my work generally and today. I'm both sorry and glad to disappoint you. But the wager I have made is that the ball on the roulette table might suddenly jump from the red slot into the black. That my busness and my performance of disappointment and failure might, through some magical serendipitous transformation, end up being a win for this conference and for the bus tradition itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. I was looking forward to being disappointed, and you didn't disappoint. So I think what you have brought out is the immense stakes with which you can say, live our lives in the academy. And I think these stakes are not apparent to us, at least to those of us on the outside, that we really risk our entire being on what we write, on what we think. And in many ways, the rewards, as you say, are not even comparable to what we can lose. Right? So I would really ask people to please raise some questions and ask Tim what you can say, be wondering about this talk that he's given, and whether he has really disappointed you or not. I think I would also like to know whether he has really succeeded in disappointing you. Or maybe like the Hegelian, you can say, that wizened dwarf that sits within the machine that Walter Benjamin talks about. Maybe you have actually, you can say, transformed this disappointment into some kind of, you can say, victory or some kind of success. So let's see what everyone has to say.
Question,
yeah.
Thank you. That was just thrillingly enjoyable. Not a single moment of busness, dullness. I was really intrigued by an adjective you used earlier while talking about Bolaño, cannibalistic, and sort of it's in a very strange way the word cannibalistic connected with what you also said in the end, that sense of staking one's own life, sort of giving away. And I was thinking initially about cannibalistic, the way we use it in the literary or the academic or the intellectual world. Another word that comes in mind is incestuous, cannibalistic, incestuous, that kind of self-gnawing, self-consuming, self-loving culture. But I think it's fascinating that in the end you gave it a kind of a really affirmative tone, that we kind of cannibalize ourselves. This whole sense of the archive out there is not something separate, that it is part of our life. I mean, I think it runs counter to a whole other tradition of criticism as objective, as scholarship as detached, and all that scary digital humanities stuff and all that. But I think I was really intrigued with whether what you said in the end, I think the question is not fully formed in my head, but it kind of does a spin towards like the cannibalistic or the incestuous, or kind of cutting part of your own body and giving it away in what you're studying. And how does that something so destructive become so enjoyable and so affirmative?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I hadn't actually thought. You've brought to my attention that metaphor in Bolaño that I think is an important one. Cannibalism is what too many conferences and too many academics do. It's eating other people's work. It's this sort of circular, incestuous, if we want to shift the metaphor, use of secondary critics, being more interested in literary criticism than actually in literature, right? This is what we were talking about at breakfast. We should ban students from using secondary literature. We should actually get them to read the real thing rather than cannibalizing other people's ideas, like this terrible one. I know cannibal has unfortunate, right, sort of racist context and the way it comes out of the Caribbean and so on, but let's use the word for a second. Most of academic life is cannibalistic, and cannibalism, of course, produces nothing. It's sort of just we're eating each other. Whereas, what you're suggesting is sort of, I don't think it's the same. It's being willing to cut off our arms. I mean, Bolaño talks about how he left teeth, his own teeth around the world as he pursued his dreams, right? Of whatever, Andres, you will know better. But literally, we being willing to sacrifice ourselves, but being willing actually to take the consequences, and not just this sterile ludism, this sterile circulation of, nothing, which is what the bulk of academic life is like, right? And rather being willing to sort of cut our own arms off. Right? And George Orwell, for example, we think of him as, he's a bit of a sacred cow. So there's a curious metaphor that come up with in English studies. But he tattoos himself in Burma, right? I mean, I'm not in favour of tattoos and so on. He gets local Burmese tattoos to sort of show his commitment to not living a respectable life, and they're on his hands. These dots that he puts on his hands. He's like saying, I'm offering my body to what I want to do, right? He does that when he leaves the Burmese police, the colonial police, as a sign that he's fully committed. He's doing this, making this Bolaño gesture of putting everything on the line, with the possible knowledge that in advance one's going to come out defeated, and that's different from cannibalism. Yeah, but it's a really good point.
Yeah, Alolika.
That was lovely. I think you succeeded at not disappointing us. So perhaps you failed in a sense.
Yes.
I really liked what you said about the 3 categories you made, playing with, playing at, and deep play, since 2 of those are transitive verbs, whereas 1 of them is a noun.
Mm-hmm.
You play with something, you play at something, but deep play is a concept. I wanted to know, might deep play include a certain degree of playing with and a certain degree of playing at? Or do you imagine each of these, or at least deep play and the other 2, as distinct from one another? So to speak, if I am engaging in deep play, were I to play with and play at, would I break the rules of deep play?
Oh my goodness, that's thank you very much, Alolika, for that really interesting question. When Kaiwa talks about, for example, the use of masks in shamanism, right? So the way in which actually mimicry topples over, and obviously anthropologically is very out of date, this is from the 60s, but this ilinx, for example, which is possession by spirits, this sort of vertiginous loss of oneself, starts off as mimicry. First of all, the shaman will put on the mask of the deer, but at some point, right, he will be transformed into it. So there isn't a clear opposition, but from a sort of ethical point of view, playing at or playing with it allows one to sort of subtract, right? Allows one to remove oneself from the consequences. Whereas I think if we really play or deep play, right, we can't walk away unscathed, right? And I think that's the ethical distinction between the 2 things. But of course there are elements of playing at, maybe not of playing with, in what I'm calling deep play. But it's the inability to sort of take off the mask and say, that wasn't me, I was just playing, that I think we don't have when we play seriously or we engage in deep play. Does that vaguely answer your question? Yeah.
There was a question here.
Thank you for an extremely enlightening and very exciting presentation. I just had one question, a little more prosaic than the earlier ones. Why did you describe your earlier conference, the conference you cited, the example of your presentation there, as having broken with your presentation? Surely in a conference, contrasting opinions, contradictory opinions, are opinions which would be enlightening and also enrich the conference. Why did you describe it as broken?
It actually broke. It came to an end. It stopped, right? And it had to be abandoned because we couldn't find do what you're suggesting normally conferences do. I mean, there's a whole load of context here, and it wasn't just my fault, incidentally, and whatever. The fuller account is available, right? But the conference actually broke. It's like we were to say, oh God, what Tim said is so awful. Amit might say, I'm afraid we can't do this. We're just all going to go off and disperse. That was effectively what happened in the conference that I described.
But isn't that an intellectual breakdown?
Yes, indeed. It was a breakdown of the ability to discuss because I broke on some sort of rules. Some of them unwitting, some of them, you know, there were mines I trod on that wasn't my fault. I wasn't aware of tensions and so on. But some of it were to do with a sort of a different conception of what we do in the humanities, as to how we're serious and how we play, and what is serious and what we can play with. But it was a breakdown. It was a serious breakdown, and there were all sorts of ramifications afterwards. My senior colleague and this other senior person, who I shan't name, but she's the director of an important institute, we had to have a come to Jesus meeting, as we call it, and, you know, and work out how our institutions would collaborate in the future, etc. Yeah, no, not good. I mean, you know, I'm fine. I've got my job. So.
There's one more question.
This is being on YouTube, isn't it? I have to be careful about what I say.
Thank you very much. That was a very enjoyable presentation. I was wondering, I mean, I really like this distinction you were making about playing at, which is a form of distance, of distancing himself, playing with, which is a form of abuse in a way, and this playing proper or deep playing, where you had a sort of a heuristic side of it, but also you emphasize this kind of relation between this vertigo between lose and loss. I mean, like getting yourself loose and the possibility of losing it, everything. But also there was a theme of cannibalism that has a different, is a different metaphor in South America, where it had been used basically in the way we were talking yesterday to actually eat and defeat the colonizer and transform him into your own power, all this tradition of the Andrade, etc. But my question had to do with, where does the relation with child play engage in all this? Because you mentioned Orwell. I remember this idea of the best electric train. I mean, like filming, or I don't know if it was Hitchcock or Orwell, but one of the two. And then when you said yesterday, I'm going to steal one of the quotes, I thought you were thinking of Ribeiro's quote, which is this one. This is Ribeiro speaking about writing and playing. He says, again, I draw the analogy between play and the act of writing, and always starting from the observation of my son. Both activities are explorations of one's own personality, and in this sense, journey, fun, surprise, and discovery. I realize that the state of mind that leads him, my son, to his toys is very similar to the one that seats me in front of my typing machine. Dissatisfaction, boredom, desire to give the world to the other or the others in ourselves, in the end to unfold or multiply in the mirror of our fantasy.
Yeah.
And I thought, so I'm wondering how does this scheme of play relates to this more basic homo ludens that we have and that we are born more instinctively with. Even the Aristotelian idea of child.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, Andres. So in the book, basically, I use Homo Ludens, a housing book that some of you may know as a sort of basis. And the point there is that play is separate from life, right? It's a place, a special place and a special time, you know, the rugby pitch and the 80 minutes of the game, where some rules of ordinary life are suspended. So, for example, in rugby, you can throw people violently to the floor, but others are imposed, like you have to pass the ball backwards. And play is described as being something separate from life. And it's that separation that, as playfulness, that engenders the sterile ludism of the academy, actually. That's why this conference is so good. It's not just full of... It's people who come from different play spheres. It doesn't have that strict boundary around it. It's not sort of demarcated. Now, children, right, importantly, don't have that extent, those borders. They don't think of play in that housing and separate space and time thing. As Benjamin says, when the child plays at being a locomotive or an aeroplane, right, he really becomes it, right? There is there's a sense that what children really do when they really play is always deep, right? Is always sort of, transgressive, and always doesn't recognize the distinction between, play and life. So in that sense, I think maybe we're on the same wavelength. Yeah.
I think Sanchit has given the permission to say that our games have now ended. So,
Thank you, Dr. Beasley-Murray, and thank you, Dr. Siddiqi. From whatever I managed to catch in the beginning, I was wondering if Tim had his way, it would perhaps be called the ninth play or the ninth pretense in the literary activism series. But thank you so much. We'll break for tea and be back quickly.